briefly, the background to this crisis is something I think well understood in this room. President Yanukovych came into office as president in 2010, the beneficiary of a free and fair election that then President Yushchenko oversaw. And unfortunately, in office, he worked towards the worst expectations that folks had of him. And by that I mean we've seen a steady erosion of the freedoms that had been instituted under Yushchenko. We've seen, at best, mediocre economic management. We've seen, of course, Ukraine as a victim, as many countries were a victim of the Great World Recession. And finally, the particular Ukrainian and Yanukovych contribution to their own misery, we've seen an increase over the already high levels of corruption that have characterized Ukrainian society since independence and before. And as a result of all these things, President Yanukovych's approval ratings would make President Obama seem very happy with his current ratings. Ratings in this low 20s, high teens. And recognizing that, because he's no fool, and recognizing that he had an election coming up in early 2015, he was taking steps to make sure that the opposition would be as weak as possible. So Yulia Tymoshenko remains in jail, and legislation was working its way through the Rada to make sure that Vitaly Klitschko could not be a candidate. This is the far backdrop to what we see in the streets of Kyiv today. The immediate backdrop, of course, are the negotiations between Ukraine and the EU regarding the trade association agreement. And that trade association agreement put a serious dilemma in front of President Yanukovych. Because on the one hand, a majority of Ukrainians wanted the agreement. On the one hand, most Ukrainian big business folk, the oligarchs we read about all the time, wanted that agreement, including the big business folk from Donetsk, from the Donbass in general, from Odessa, from the south. And they wanted that agreement, and they want that agreement, because they understand their economic future is going to be much more prosperous, associated with the EU, than associated with the customs union to nowhere. And the EU insisted on a variety of conditions for that agreement, changes in the rule of law, changes in the way the economy is structured, and the release of Yulia Tymoshenko. The seriousness with which the Yanukovych administration took these negotiations was evident in the fact that most of the legislation required regarding abstract but real subjects like rule of law were in fact passed. Most of that legislation passed. But releasing the lady, well, that's a little bit harder, because she was and is the most potent force in the opposition. And Yanukovych did not want to risk her live on the streets of Kyiv and other cities in Ukraine, because, interestingly, and this is part of her appeal, she has reasonable support in the east and the south, the traditionally strong areas of the country, on the party of the regions. So for President Yanukovych, it was a very simple choice. The economic good of the country, including, and this is important, the economic good of his backers, those oligarchs who support him, versus his political future. And he chose his political future, and he walked away from the negotiations with the EU, and this is the thing that still surprises me, a week before the Vilnius summit. But the motivation was overwhelmingly internal, despite all the geopolitical analysis that this was really Russia exerting its influence in the country. The Russian factor was not unimportant, but not the most significant. To use that word that Ariel dislikes a little Moldova was able to withstand Russian pressure. And little Georgia has withstood Russian pressure ever since Saakashvili became president, and even since his departure. And the sanctions that Ukraine has tasted are not as large, not nearly as large as the sanctions that Georgia has withstood. So Yanukovych's reasons were overwhelmingly internal, relating to the preservation of his power and the wealth that seems to come along with power in Ukraine, which of course is one of the tragedies of the country. Yanukovych, had to have expected some response to his tossing away the negotiations, the initial demonstrations. And so when tens of thousands of people appeared on the street, he did something really stupid, or people advising him did something really stupid, and they sent in the police to break up those demonstrations in a ham-handed, in a repressive way, sending hundreds to the hospital, arresting hundreds. And this was his serious mistake, because he did not understand at that time, and maybe he understands now, maybe not. I think he's coming to an understanding of Ukrainian political culture. As President Kuchma wrote a whole book about, Ukraine is not Russia. And while Ukrainians are not a sinless people, they do not appreciate the massive use of force to break up peaceful demonstrators. And so you had hundreds of thousands of people in the street. And my sense is, watching what's happened since then, that the Yanukovych team understands that now, or kind of understands it. So you've had an impasse now for about a week and a half. And on the one hand, you have the Yanukovych administration, which does not want to cede anything, or has not wanted to cede anything. And a kind of clear indication of that was when Yanukovych took off for China and Russia. Now, ironically, and irony is not something which goes down well with the Party of the Regions, Yanukovych was doing something, making a parallel mistake to one Yushchenko made after he was elected. Because he went off on a grand triumphal tour through the West when he should have been paying attention to what was going on in Kyiv, and specifically what his partner, Yulia Tymoshenko, was doing to undermine him. But Yanukovych heard in Beijing and in Moscow just the sort of message he wanted to hear, which is not the message he needed to hear. Because those are regimes which think that dealing harshly with demonstrators in the street is business as usual. But, and this is an important but, even as he was hearing these messages, he knew he could not send massed units onto the Maidan to clear the square. So that was the Yanukovych side of this. Then you have the opposition side. Now, an important thing to understand about what's going on the streets in Kyiv is that this whole phenomenon was not planned by the opposition. This was spontaneous. And that's a good thing because it tells you something important about Ukrainian political culture. In that sense, it was somewhat like the Arab Spring. It sort of appeared out of nowhere. And the opposition then began to play catch-up. Of course, they were on the streets right away. But they did not at the beginning, and I'm not certain that as of this morning, they control the streets. I think they have a much better handle than they did a week ago, but it's not clear that they really control the demonstrators. But they're trying to control them. And just as Yanukovych was not willing to concede anything a few days ago, although there's some news this morning that suggests he's now willing to make some concessions, the opposition was also overreaching. Yulia Tymoshenko was out there playing revolutionary in a situation which was not and is still not quite revolutionary, although I think it is transformative. I agree with Ara, this is a very important moment in Ukrainian history. And the opposition was demanding, as it demands down to this moment, that certainly the resignation of the government, which does not mean Yanukovych, it means Azarov, the prime minister, but also the resignation of Yanukovych. And of course, that's not going to happen anytime soon. The opposition took heart from the fact that key members of the Yanukovych team began to peel off. Lyovichkin, the chief of staff, resigned. Smart on his part. Several members of the Party of the Region resigned from the Party of the Regions. But But, and this is a very important but, they did not enough folks change sides to enable the opposition to pass in the Rada the vote of no confidence. So you had to have a stalemate. The next move on the part of the administration was, okay, they learned that big force does not work. So let's try a little force. And let's try propaganda. And the propaganda was in the announcements that, well, gee, there's been some coup plotting going on. And the government, which could not find the officials responsible for sending people into the streets, sending the police into the streets on November 30, are now searching for coup plotters. And they seize all the records at Timoshenko's party headquarters. And they say to the demonstrators, you're on your own, and you should know we may come to get you later on. So there's all sort of psychological warfare. And then, what was it, not this night, the previous night, the police go back into the square, where there are not nearly as many demonstrators, and try to take this piece of property, that piece of property, so they control this part of Kiev, and to push their demonstrators off the Maidan. But they failed. They failed the second time. Big force failed, little force failed. And little force failed not just because there was some type of early warning system among the demonstrators, so they were able to get people to come back into the streets at 4 and 5 in the morning, but also because the police themselves did not have the training and the mindset to take out those batons and really go after the demonstrators. So big force failed, little force failed. And now we have reports coming in that Yanukovych is saying he will sign the agreement with the EU. Now, of course, the most important question is, what does that mean? Does that mean that he's going to release Gospoja Timoshenko? I don't know. I don't know. That's the key question. So we've got a stalemate. And, another important development, another positive important development. A few days ago, Presidents Kravchuk, Kuchma, and Yushchenko issue a joint statement. Who ever thought those three could get together to do anything? And it sounded like the type of statement that maybe Presidents Bush and Clinton would put together, a statement for the good of the country. Again, who'd have thought it? Who'd have thought it? And they expressed sympathy with the demonstrators. Good. They used the phrase civil society. Kuchma uses the phrase civil society. Good. And they say to Yanukovych, you got to work with these guys to come to a solution that suits the country, that works for the good of the country. Amazing. Amazing. So I think we're in a stalemate where slowly, and maybe eventually it'll be fastly, things are moving in the right direction. Now, what can we do? I don't think it's so bad that the United States has let the EU take the lead. I don't think it's so bad that the EU has not been as activist as it could be. Because it's a good thing for this to play out some with largely or overwhelmingly Ukrainian cast. But there is a role for leadership, both Western European and American, and there are things that we can and should do. I agree with Elliot that the statement Kerry made yesterday, that the statement Kerry made was unusual in its vividness, and that was a good thing. I also think that the IMF is a card that can be played, although I don't think that's the most important card. On the basis of my own experience 9 years ago, the big card we can play is individual sanctions. We should have already informed the Minister of Interior in Ukraine that he is not welcome in the United States. And we should be collecting names and we should be consulting with the opposition to know who we think is really driving this. And one or two well-placed, you are not welcome in the United States, to individuals in Kiev, and a general spreading around of this message to those who are in authority right now, I think will have a wonderfully positive effect, a more important effect than anything else we can do. We do not want to take sanctions against the country. Why should individual Ukrainians, why should the average Ukrainian in Dnipropetrovsk or Lviv suffer because she has a wayward government? But individuals, that's different. And let's understand, no one loves the Yanukovych regime because they're wonderful ideals or because they are good for the country. People who are loyal to that regime are loyal because they expect to get something from it, some payback. And that payback always comes at the price of the Ukrainian economy and Ukrainian citizens. So that's why individual sanctions are the one thing that we can do. Thank you.